There's two elements. The first element is an internal element of yourself, right? You have to, it's kind of funny because there's two stages. The first stage is not treat them differently. You have to be able to treat the 9 or the 10 the exact same way you treat the 6 or the 7, because if not, if you start treating her differently, if you start being like, oh, this one's special, oh, I actually like this one, oh, I have to like be extra clever with this one, or oh, I have to spend 10 minutes on my text with this one, and then you always send an awful text after you spend that long. If you start overthinking it and just treating her differently and chasing too hard, that's obviously not going to work. So that's the first step, is you have to legitimately just realize that women of all appearances are like 99.9% genetically identical, and what works on one pretty much works on another. They're kind of, they're the same, and you are enough, right? You are fundamentally a healthy young male of the species, and she's a healthy young female of the species. And with any animals, if you put those two together long enough, they're probably going to mate, right? That's just how it is. And you are enough, right? And the threshold is that, enough. Right? You don't have to be Leonardo DiCaprio to have sex, otherwise there wouldn't be 8 billion people on the planet. Right? So just understand that if you are enough and if you are attractive, that's it. Also understand that once an incredibly, extremely hot girl likes you, she's going to act the same way as an average-looking girl who likes you. Right? So go based on her actions and go based on what she's giving you, rather than based on your idea that she's this like mythical alien creature that should be in a magazine. Right? So you need to legitimately get that through your head, and you need to treat them the same. That's step one, period, right? Until you do that, you are not going to end up with those high caliber girls, because you're just going to self-sabotage or mess it up or do that kind of stuff, right? So that's the first thing, is you have to realize that there are a lot of them out there, same as there are a lot of girls out there. You are worthy, and you are bringing a lot of value to the table. It's so easy to think how much she's bringing to the table by her hotness, but think about all the things you're bringing to the table with the experience you can bring, right? How cool you're going to be, how fun you're going to be, the things you can teach her, the things you can do with her, experiences you're going to give her, all those kind of things, right? You need to remember you're bringing value also. Ironically, step 2, once you've done step 1, once you emotionally are not treating the hot girl as different, you want to very slightly technically treat the hot girl different, okay? But you have to do step 1 before step 2. If you try and do step 2 first, it won't work, right? And the way you'll know you've achieved step 1 is you start to occasionally get the hottest girls, right? So if you're like never getting the hottest girls, you probably have, if you're getting consistently like cute girls but not the hottest girls, you probably have some kind of emotional hang up or some kind of inner game thing that's keeping you from that. Once you get past that, you'll start to occasionally get the hottest girls, but still less often than you are the slightly less hot girls, right? That's when you're emotionally there and you're good. And then what you need to do is you need to start actually treating them a little bit differently. And the reason for that is that hot girls have a slightly different life, like very, very hot girls have a slightly different life oftentimes than the girls who are just cute, right? Oftentimes they are paid to be hot, right? Oftentimes they're working in industries where that's actually their job. And so that's a different lifestyle. And if you understand that lifestyle and have some familiarity with it, that can help. They also are getting a lot more offers, and you have to do a little more to stand out. So you may have to be a little more polarizing in your game, right? But the problem is you can't be reactive in being polarizing, so you still have to do step 1 first. You still have to do that step 1 of not caring anymore, and then you do the changes because they're good game, not because you're like, oh, this girl's different, oh, this girl's special, oh, I care more in this case, right? So that's kind of the process you have to go through. But once the girl, no matter how hot, once she starts to like you and chase you, it's the same, basically, right? So that's what you go off of. You don't go off of, oh, she's a 10, so I have to like give her a really hard time. If she's a 10 and she's like, complimenting you and qualifying to you and chasing you, don't be a dick to her just because she's like, oh, she's super hot, I have to be like more polarizing, right? No, she's a girl who likes you, right? And you very, very early in any interaction, you want to be dealing with the actual girl and really relating to the person in front of you and not dealing as a category or a stereotype. That make sense? So yes, you need to a certain extent, assume certain things until you know, but as soon as you have actual facts, go with the real facts, not the purported facts. In-game, in general, there's sort of 2 types of things, and this goes to your question. There's 2 types of communication going on at any given time. There's what I'll call baseline, and there's what I call plotline. Okay, and for anybody who doesn't understand that, baseline is if someone were to ask you afterwards what was discussed, what were the topics of conversation, that kind of stuff, what was the actual subject matter, that's usually the baseline. And then plotline would be things like the teases, the emotional spikes, if you do takeaway, all that kind of stuff, the things that are meant to be emotionally relevant, or the things you would think of as like the gamey moves, right? And there's a very interesting thing that happens as you get better at game is you'll go from focusing a lot on baseline to focusing on plotline and then focusing back on baseline. So guys who don't know any game, they basically are just having a conversation and hoping it'll work. And they typically oftentimes have very, very good baseline. James, I'm looking at you, how you started in game when I first met you, basically, right? Really, really good at storytelling, really, really good at conversation, but not doing a lot of like the gamey type stuff. And then what can happen is you start to learn how to do the gamey type stuff, and you realize that you get reactions from it. You realize that when I say you and I would not get along, the girl reacts a certain way. I say like, part of me loves you, part of me hates you, the girl reacts a certain way. And it's very easy to get addicted to that because it's very fun. It's very easy to start having that be more and more of your conversation. And it is very, very useful. And it will actually help you up to a certain point in game. It will help you a lot. Because the fact that you are ballsy enough to say those things, the fact that you understand the male-female dynamic well enough to say those kind of things, it shows a lot of social intelligence in a certain way, etc. But there is a problem at a certain level, which is that it is gamey, right? And the best game should actually just happen. It shouldn't be gamey. It shouldn't look try-hard. It shouldn't look like there's something going on. It should just seem like it just happened, our eyes met, and it was beautiful, and etc. And so what actually ends up happening as you get better and better at game is that you start to game through your baseline as well as your plot line. You start to choose the topics that are most useful to you, and those topics do a couple different things. Number one, you're conveying value through those topics. You're conveying your story through those topics. You can actually flirt in a way through those topics, and it's less gamey. It's less try hard, right? And in fact, that it also encourages more flirtation as well. So you could, in theory, in game, have a conversation about, let's say, travel. Travel is an interesting subject because a lot of people like talking about it, and it's a fun subject. You could have a whole conversation about travel, never even mentioning man to woman, but throughout the conversation be like, occasionally, oh my God, you like that place? I'm totally breaking up with you, right? Or be like, oh my God, I'm never traveling with you if you're going to go there, right? So you could have the plotline moves around this completely platonic baseline conversation that actually would work as game. Problem is that you would have to have a lot of those plotline moves, and you'd keep going back to zero over and over again and keep having to spike it up. So it would definitely be harder. It would be a lot easier for the conversation to go in a direction that is sexual or relationship-y if the topics you're addressing in the conversation are also of that nature, right? If you start talking about things like, what kind of trouble did you get into when you were younger? Where do you like to party? If you get into like what makes a good kiss, you get into talking about those kind of things. Obviously, the conversation, the topics themselves have gotten more sexual. That's going to lead to more flirting. It's going to lead to more banter, and it's going to make the teasing easier. It's also going to mean you need less teasing because those topics themselves create some intensity. So you're not having to create all the intensity through gamey moves, right? And again, the fewer gamey moves you have in your conversation, the better off you are. So steering the frame, steering the direction of the conversation can be very, very useful. In order to have good baseline conversation, don't think of it as pointless, right? If you think of that as the pointless part, you're going to be bored by it. But if you think of that as actually having importance as well and having meaning as well and dictating things as well, now you can be hopefully more engaged in it. You can also be more strategic about it because it doesn't feel so aimless, right? And I bet that if you're talking to a hot girl, you'd rather talk about kissing than the weather. Just a guess, right? And I'm guessing that if you're into a particular thing, like what's a hobby you have?
Breakdancing.
Breakdancing, awesome. That's a very useful hobby in game. Like you must be very fun in the club. But yeah, so I bet you're more passionate talking about that than you'd be talking about like knitting, for example, right? So if you're talking about the things you like to talk about, you're going to be more passionate about that, and that's going to make the conversation more fun for you, right? So in terms of having something to say, the two things I would ask you to do is number one, talk about the things that you want to talk about, right? If you're bored by a topic, like if you're zoning out during the conversation, change the topic. I almost say even if the topic's really good. Like if the girl's talking about her sexual fantasies and you're zoning out, there's first of all probably something wrong and that's probably not the girl you're into. But that one maybe you should let her keep talking about. But in general, if she's talking about some random thing and you're zoning out, change the subject to something you're going to be engaged by. You need to be engaged in the conversation. The girl will know if you're zoning out and you'll find it hard to come up with things to say. So talk about the things you genuinely want to talk about, the things you're passionate about, the things you're interested in. And also talk about the subjects that lead towards sex. Talk about the subjects. If you want to have an intimate relationship with a girl, talk about intimate topics. Talk about sexual things. Talk about, so here's topics related to sex that actually, first kind of example of this. There was a survey on OkCupid years and years ago. They had all these different profile questions, and they wanted to find out which profile question correlated most to the question, would you have a one-night stand, that was not sexual in nature. The question they found was, do you enjoy the taste of beer? So I found, do you enjoy the taste of beer correlated to would you have a one-night stand very, very strongly, at least in the United States. I don't know if it would be the same because you have a slightly different culture here. But in any case, the point is there are certain topics that are sexual without being sexual, right? You've heard the phrase sex, drugs, rock and roll before, right? Drinking, partying, traveling, piercings, tattoos, drugs, breaking the law in any way, all of those kind of topics are all sort of vaguely related to sex, excuse me, without being sexual. So those are nice kind of like gateway topics to sex. If you bring those kind of topics up, bring those into the conversation, then the conversation will naturally go in that direction. Other thing in terms of topics of conversation, I don't know if in the UK, do you guys have the game Truth or Dare? Do you guys play that? Right? As like middle school, high school kids, I don't know, you don't have middle school, whatever. As younger kids and even in college, a lot of times those kind of games led to sex, right? So you have Truth or Dare, Never Have I Ever, you have the question game, if you guys have ever heard of that one. Any of those kind of games tend to lead conversations in a sexual way. So you could play those games with girls if you wanted to. That's a little obvious, a little on the nose. But why do those games work? Those games work because they naturally escalate the topic, right? So if you're talking about, you start out talking about tattoos and piercings and getting in trouble with your parents, then you might talk about other areas that your parents didn't approve of growing up, sex being one of those, right? So, and the other thing is that you naturally try and one-up people during those games. And so if you can create that kind of thing where you're trying to like, oh, I have this story. Oh, yeah, I have this more impressive story. I go deeper with it. That kind of a frame can be very fun and can definitely lead in a sexual direction, right? So those are some ideas in terms of just coming up with topics and keeping things going. The final thing I'll say in terms of coming up with topics, though, we'll go the opposite. 'Cause I gave you a bunch of ways to come up with good topics. Here's the other thing I'll say. Lower your standard for what it has to be. So try and come up with good topics. Try and have great conversation. But if you truly are like, I can't think of anything to say, just say something. Because silence and killing the conversation is not the solution. And very often, when things have been going relatively well and you don't know what to say, the girl doesn't know what to say either. And if you will just throw out anything, she would be more than happy to continue the conversation rather than leaving. But she doesn't know what to say either. And she's, across the board, girls are kind of in a tougher spot than us because we like them, they like us, we both want it to go somewhere, but they're under more obligation to not be at fault. They're under more obligation to not seem easy, not seem slutty, that kind of stuff, right? And so you kind of need to help them along. And so oftentimes the girl would like the conversation to continue, but you need to actually be the one to do the work early on. While there are all kinds of great topics to talk about, if you're at a point where it's like, I really don't know what to say, anything will be fine, and the bar is not that high. So do keep that in mind as well, because oftentimes your brain just is convincing you it has to be brilliant, whereas it doesn't. It just has to be keep your lips moving, literally.